It's the 25th of December, Christmas Day, and I am about to do the saltwater balance test for a set of resin dye. Now, obviously, since we're using water, we can't be using wood dye, and using metallic dyes are also not a great idea. The idea is, as you can hear, I've got water boiling on an electric boiler. You want to fill up the glass, preferably a see-through container. It doesn't have to be a glass, it can be a bowl as well. I chose a glass because, well, that was first in my closet. Then you want salt. Now this is basically dishwasher salt. I don't have a dishwasher, but I do have a pavement that sometimes needs, well, salting, especially at winter because it might get slippery. This will do fine, and this is basically saying fine salt. So this is not very grainy, this is very sort of fine grains. That makes it easier to dissolve. As soon as the water have boiled up, you want to use hot water. It doesn't have to be boiling, but boil it in case you don't have completely clear water, or use bottled water just in case. It is easier with hot water, as that will make the salt dissolve easier. What we want to do as soon as the water has boiled, I might have filled the kettle a bit too much, is that we want to make a salt water mixture. And we are not only looking for salt water, we're looking for super saturated saline water. Now what that means is, as soon as I've poured about maybe halfway up, maybe 1/3, about that of water, I'm going to be adding salt in and stirring it up. That's hence the spoon. Until when I can no longer add salt, when salt is no longer dissolved, then the water in this glass will be super saturated. That will mean that the dyes will float. Now, while this, I'm doing this obviously with my offhand because I am using my right hand to film. And no, I do not have some fancy gear to just hold it. Now, we could test all the dyes in this. That might be a bit much, but we have an inkling of an idea that these two sets, the skull set and the eye set, are not particularly well balanced. To test that, I'm going to be testing the D20 of each of these 4 sets. Now obviously I had to get all of them out because, well, 20 was in there. Good. Our water had boiled. Get that and pour in. And you can see that it is pretty hot, just boiled. You literally heard it. I think this will be, yeah, that's a little below half. That will suffice. Doesn't have to be exact. It's just for the sake of how does this fit. Now this is going to be a little bit tricky because I am right-handed. I am not particularly good at handling a spoon or most other utensils with my left hand, but I'm going to give it a try. This is also a much larger bag. Closer. The amount that you have to put in varies. You can see that dissolves pretty easily. That was also just a small amount. Now I can't use that again because that would just make the that would just put more water into my salt bag, and I actually don't want that. I'll just grab another spoon. And even though this is going fairly slowly, it is a proof of concept. The water doesn't have to be hot. It just makes it easier to get it to dissolve, basically. So you can do this on your own. You can use a more grainy type of table salt. That's perfectly fine. Table salt is perhaps a little less quick to dissolve. You'd probably have to stir a little more, but otherwise it's the same principle. As long as it's salt, that should be fine. So let's see what happens if we stir this. It's a little hard to see from the side because, well, there's a steam, but you see that, yeah, you could probably better see it from the top actually. There is still a bit of salt in there. It is dissolving, so that means that we're not there yet. Now, unlike the shorts that I did for my dice calendar, this is not going to be a one take. I'm going to set up the experiment in one video, and then I'm going to perform the experiment, the test, in the other one. Well, in another one. Because I am going to need time to get the dies out of the bag, and I cannot do that whilst holding my phone. At least not very well. That's going to take a while. And I don't know if I could fill all that time. Does it look like it's... yeah, it's still dissolving. So we need more salt. There is an estimated amount on the sort of reference that I'm using, which says about 6 tablespoons. But it also says that your target is super saturation. So that's what we're going for. Plus, you can't really, for the sake of this test, over salt it. Like, you can't make it too salty. That's fine. That's actually okay. Now, it's certainly is less clear, but I think as soon as it settles, we might be able to see. Yep, nope, it's still this. Oh no, it is actually. Maybe I just have to stir it a bit more. So obviously, if you have a lot of dies, this is going to take a while. I would recommend, rather than going for all of your die straight at once, which I'm not going to do here either, is that you're going to do, if you have a set that you are suspicious about, or that perhaps your DM or others in your tabletop group have said, I don't think this die is balanced, you can test it out and see if that holds true. I'll explain how it works once we get to the experiment. Right now we're just sort of setting up. I'm going to stir a bit more, perhaps a bit too vigorously. Got a little bit of water on the table, but that's fine. It's pretty sturdy, made of oak, has been treated. I don't know if, well, there is a way to test, and that is also actually why it's a good thing to test if your water is saturated. If you drop a die down into it, if this die floats, then your test is saturated enough. It does look like it, as this is quite a certain amount of salt that is on the bottom, and the container isn't that big, so stirring it should have dissolved it already. Let's see if we can do like this, and then it floats. All right, good. Now time for experimenting. The salt water dice balancing test experiment. So I've made my salt water, still pretty hot, and I've tested that the salt water is now as saturated so that a resin die would be able to float. So the way this works is, because it is in water, that means that there is nothing that will affect how it rolls. Now, obviously it will settle at some point, but the idea is basically to drop it down, you see that I've already marked down which side appeared upwards. What you want to look for if a die is balanced or not, if it lands on the same two numbers or same three sort of in the same category. So if this one, for example, landed on 18, 2, and 12, it's probably not balanced if it does that all the way through. If it does a random amount of numbers, or if there doesn't seem to be any patterns, then it's good, then it's balanced. And as you can see, a thing to be aware of, when you're using a fine grain type of salt, it can get into your die, so you might want to give it a regular wash off when you're done. But let's get to testing. So I have decided to roll each of these D20s 6 times and mark down what I'm getting. I'll speed this part up and then I'll basically make a conclusion afterwards. Okay, this is a little peculiar because in a supersaturated glass of salt water, a resin die should be able to float on its own. The skull die is not floating. That is concerning because that means that something is perhaps a little bit wrong. I'll try and stir up, see if I can... Perhaps I need to add more salt to this, but it won't saturate, so I don't know if that's going to do anything. That's peculiar. I did not expect that. All right, well, it's not a great sign. Let's see if it works better with this one. It sinks as well. Now, let's see. Yes, there's definitely clearly salt on the bottom here. You can even see it on the sides and the droplets that they leave sort of a salty trace. That means that I can't really test them like this. That is a bummer. But this isn't a complete waste because it does prove something. It proves that there is something different about these die. And I would be very hesitant as a DM, I would probably not allow these die. Simply because I don't believe that they are balanced. That's not to say that I think that they are unbalanced with malicious intent. Like, I don't think that someone is trying to cheat using these die. But it wouldn't be a good random example either. However, it is not all for naught, because we do have two comparable results. Now this die was from the dice calendar. It was actually one of the first dies that I got at all, if not the first. I don't expect this one to be unbalanced. It does have a mixture of clear and opaque resin, but there's nothing inside of it. And that's really the selling point. This one, which basically I call stone because it looks like stone. I think it was called dusty stone when I bought it. So you can see the spread here. At no point, now obviously 6 rolls is not really a great empirical data set. You'd want, for more accuracy, you'd want more rolls. If you want, like, you can never get 100% accuracy because it is random. But nothing in these data set like 4, 9, 15, 1, 20, 11, none of those are repeats, none of those are right next to another. Same goes over here with the stone die. 17, 16, 12, 3, 5, and 19. I don't see anything that indicates that these dies are unbalanced. Now, the stone dice was taken into this experiment as sort of I expect this one to be balanced, sort of a control die. I was uncertain about this cloudy die. And, well, I don't know what to make of this. These guys, they won't float. And it's not because there isn't salt in the water. You see it down there. I can try and stir it some more, but I'm not sure. I don't think it's going to be... Yeah, there's always going to be something that settles, so that means that you can't add more salt into it. The amount of salt in the water is as high as it can get. Because otherwise, the recipe or guideline that I'm following is saying that if a dye doesn't float, add more salt. But you can't add more salt when it is already super saturated. So the eye set and the skull set, I was kind of hoping that the skull set would be a little more lenient, because it's not as bad looking. Like, you could maybe argue that it is more likely to land on 18 and 2, as that seems to be where most of the weight is at. You can see that's the skull, pretty close by. But, I mean, I had anticipated that it would roll, and maybe perhaps a little less balanced than the control sets. But I did certainly not expect it to just plonk right down and sink. So, I don't know what to make of this. I am quite certain that it doesn't exactly prove that they are unbalanced, but it certainly proves that they don't act like normal die. Alright, well, if you want to try this at home, all you need to do is have something to boil the water, a clear glass container, so basically so that you can see if there is salt at the bottom. You can see my fingers here covered in it right now. Something to stir with, doesn't have to be a spoon, that was just the first utensil I could grab. And yeah, I would still go for a finer grain of salt rather than a more sturdy like table salt, but table salt would work just as well. It basically just have to be salt. And clean salt. No other kind of salt in it. Clean salt, so table salt would be fine, you know that it's clear, but dishwasher salt, that's also fine, that's also just salt. And then it's basically just boil the water, saturate it with salt, which means that when you can no longer dissolve any more salt in the water, then you made a super saturated salt water. That means that a resin dye, and this is important, only use resin dye, clear or opaque, doesn't matter. Normally, even dye like these should float. So I don't know what went wrong for my case, but that is essentially the gist of the saltwater balance test for adventure game tabletop dyes. And well, if you want to try it yourself, just make sure that if you're young enough, get an adult to help you, or get a friend to help you, because you can have a better observation skill and perhaps have someone else to hold the camera if you want to record it. That is the basics of the saltwater balance test. And yes, I could have rolled some more. I don't think it would have mattered much. I think these two die are pretty well balanced. I've even done, completely unrelated to this, a dry roll test, which of course doesn't prove anything because, well, it's dry. But I had seen some worrying tendencies with both, well, not so much with the entire set of the eye set, but quite a lot with the skull set, but quite a lot with the eye set. I rolled each die 20 times, and particularly the D6, the D8, and I think it was, the D12 were really tending towards wanting to roll the smallest number. Obviously, that's not a die that you can use to cheat with, as in most games you want to roll the highest, but still, but a dry roll test can only give you a statistical idea. It might be off balance, but it might also be a coincidence, might be statistics. Using the saltwater test, you can have a more basic idea because the salt water basically makes it float, and as there is no friction in the water, that's why it's floating, it would naturally land on a side. And if that side is not unbalanced, the side should be random. Okay, I will get to editing these, and hopefully we've all learned something today. I've definitely learned that these two never gonna get used. They're gonna be like sitting on a shelf and looking pretty. Well, see you next time.